John Rockefeller, the man who owned America's oil. Imagine that tomorrow you decide to start a business. You work very hard, you make a better product, reduce your costs, and defeat your competitors. Nothing unusual about that. But then you keep winning and winning again and again until eventually most of your competitors are either bought by you, they are crushed by you, or terrified of you. Your company becomes so powerful that it can negotiate special deals with railways, influence the price of an essential commodity, and dominate an enormous part of an entire American industry. At that point, one question arises: when does a successful business become too powerful? This is the story of the man who forced America to confront that question. His name was John Rockefeller. John Davidson Rockefeller was born in 1839 in Richford, New York. His family was not extraordinarily wealthy. His father, William Rockefeller, was an unconventional traveling salesman, while his mother, Eliza, was deeply religious and disciplined. From his mother, young John absorbed two habits that would remain with him throughout his life: religion and financial discipline. Rockefeller was a devout Baptist and he loved numbers, not advanced mathematics but accounts, income, expenses, profit, and loss. At 16, he left school, completed a business course, and found work as an assistant bookkeeper in Cleveland. Imagine the future richest man in America sitting at a desk recording someone else's transactions. But Rockefeller was learning. He learned how goods moved. He learned transportation. He learned credit and accounting. And above everything else, he learned something that would later become an obsession. Waste is the enemy of profit. In 1859, using $1,000 of his own savings and another $1,000 borrowed from his father, Rockefeller entered business with Maurice Clark. That same year, Edwin Drake's famous oil well helped ignite America's petroleum boom, and Rockefeller saw an opportunity. This was before petrol powered cars dominated the world. The great petroleum product of the age was kerosene. People needed kerosene for lamps, and Pennsylvania was producing enormous quantities of crude oil. The oil business became a kind of 19th century gold rush. People rushed in. Oil wells appeared all over the place. Refineries appeared. Fortunes were made and fortunes were lost. Prices fluctuated wildly. And Rockefeller looked at this chaotic industry and thought there has to be a more efficient way of doing this. He was not particularly interested in drilling for oil because drilling was risky. You could spend money digging and find nothing. Rockefeller preferred refining. Take crude oil, process it, turn it into useful products, and sell those products efficiently. So in 1863, Rockefeller and his partners entered oil refining in Cleveland. 2 years later, following a dispute between the partners, their refinery was auctioned among them. Rockefeller bought it for $72,500. He was only 25 years old, and now the real story begins. The real story of Standard Oil. Rockefeller became obsessed with efficiency. Why throw away petroleum byproducts when they could be sold? Why buy barrels from somebody else when you could manufacture your own? Why depend completely on outside transport and storage? Reducing waste, controlling costs, and increasing scale became his obsession. He started negotiating better transportation rates. In 1870, Rockefeller and his partners established the Standard Oil Company with a capital of $1 million. And then Rockefeller began swallowing Cleveland's oil refining industry. He approached competing refiners. Sometimes they sold willingly, and sometimes the alternatives were considerably less attractive. Standard Oil's enormous scale gave it advantages that smaller refiners struggled to match. One particular controversial weapon involved the railroads. Oil had to travel. Railroads wanted enormous, reliable customers. Standard Oil could provide enormous volumes of freight. That gave Rockefeller tremendous bargaining power to obtain favorable transportation arrangements. Now imagine being a small refiner competing against him. You buy crude oil, refine it, and put it into barrels, and you ship it. But Rockefeller can operate more efficiently and negotiate transportation on better terms. Your margins shrink, and eventually Rockefeller arrives with an offer to buy, and many people sold their companies. By 1872, Standard Oil had acquired nearly all of Cleveland's refining firms. Rockefeller was building an empire. But Rockefeller did not stop with horizontal expansion, just buying competitors. Standard Oil increasingly controlled different stages surrounding its business, like an octopus. It acquired storage, transportation, pipelines, barrels, distribution, and refining. It became an enormous integrated machine, and economically, there was something genuinely impressive about it. Standardization improved, costs reduced, waste was reduced, and production became more efficient. This is what makes Rockefeller's story interesting. He was not simply a cartoon villain stealing money, he was an extraordinary businessman. By the very efficiency that made Standard Oil successful, however, also gave it frightening power. By the 1890s, Standard Oil was estimated to control about 75% of the American petroleum business. Competitors started complaining, politicians became concerned, journalists began investigating, cartoonists began depicting Standard Oil like an enormous octopus, its tentacles reaching into industry and the government. America was discovering a fundamental problem of capitalism, that competition can produce winners. But what happens when the winner becomes powerful enough to destroy competition itself? There was another problem. America consisted of individual states with different corporate laws. How could Rockefeller coordinate dozens of companies operating across the country? By 1882, Standard Oil developed what became one of the most famous corporate structures in American history, the Standard Oil Trust. Shareholders in various Standard Oil companies placed their shares under trustees. The result was centralized control over a vast network of business. The word trust soon became associated in the public mind with giant concentrations of corporate power, and Standard Oil became the symbol of the problem. Americans increasingly asked, can democracy remain healthy when private corporations become this powerful? Eventually, America started fighting back. In 1890, the United States Congress passed one of the most important economic laws in American history, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Its basic purpose was to attack combinations that unlawfully restrained interstate trade and attempts to monopolize commerce. In simple language, if you become successful, that is rewarded. If you become huge, that is not automatically illegal. But if you use combinations and monopoly to unreasonably suppress competition, now the government will intervene. The law would eventually become one of the foundations of American competition policy. But Standard Oil did not simply disappear. After an Ohio court ordered the original trust to be dissolved, the organization was eventually reorganized around Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, taking advantage of New Jersey corporate law that allowed a corporation to own shares in other corporation. The octopus had changed its legal structure. It had not disappeared. Then came one of Rockefeller's most formidable opponents. It was not some billionaire or oil company. It was a journalist, Ida Tarbell. Her investigation of Standard Oil exposed its history and controversial competitive practices to millions of Americans. And there was something personal about it. Tarbell's father had worked in the Pennsylvania oil industry and had experienced the upheaval caused by Standard Oil's rise. Her reporting helped turn Rockefeller into the great public symbol of monopoly capitalism or crony capitalism. By now, Rockefeller himself had largely withdrawn from the day to day leadership of Standard Oil. He stepped back from active leadership in the 1890s, but the empire that he had created remained, and the federal government was coming for it. United States versus Standard Oil. This was the case that the federal government brought against the Standard Oil in 1906, an antitrust case. The question eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, and in 1911, the court delivered the historic decision that Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Supreme Court interpreted the act using what became known as the rule of reason. The law targeted unreasonable restraints of trade rather than treating every restraint identically. And the remedy was enormous. The Standard Oil combination had to be dismantled. The parent corporation's control was broken apart, separating its constituent companies into independent separate businesses. The Rockefeller Archive Center describes 38 controlled companies being separated. The empire had been dismantled. But Rockefeller did not lose. And this is the most wonderful irony. He was not destroyed. He owned shares in Standard Oil. When Standard Oil was divided, shareholders received interests in the resulting companies, and many of those businesses remained extremely valuable. Some of the corporate descendants of Standard Oil would eventually become associated with names familiar throughout the modern petroleum industry. So the government destroyed Rockefeller's unified monopoly, but it did not destroy Rockefeller's wealth. His fortune continued to grow, particularly as petroleum demand expanded with the automobile age. By around 1913, his fortune was roughly $1 billion. Yes, $1 billion in 1913. If you apply time value of money, probably he would be the richest person alive today. Rockefeller had won so spectacularly that even breaking his empire apart could not make him poor. And then something remarkable happened. The man remembered as the face of ruthless monopoly crony capitalism spent the later part of his life giving away extraordinary amounts of money for education, medicine, scientific research, and public health. He helped establish and support institutions like University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, and eventually the Rockefeller Foundation. Over his lifetime, the Rockefeller Archive Center estimates that he gave approximately $540 million to charitable causes. The businessman who became a symbol of concentrated private power also became one of history's most influential philanthropists. Rockefeller died in 1937, aged 97. So, what is the conclusion? Who was John D. Rockefeller? Was he a hero or was he a villain? A genius or a monopolist or a philanthropist? Perhaps the uncomfortable answer is that all of these labels capture only a part of him. Rockefeller demonstrated the extraordinary productive power of capitalism: scale, efficiency, innovation, cost reduction, and organization. But Standard Oil also demonstrated capitalism's paradox. Competition can eventually produce concentrations of power capable of weakening competition itself. And that is why the Rockefeller story is not just biography of a rich man. It is the story of a question that economists and governments are still arguing about more than a century later. How powerful should a private corporation be allowed to become? Because the market created Rockefeller. Rockefeller created Standard Oil. Standard Oil conquered the market, and eventually the law had to protect the market from its own winner. And that is the extraordinary story of John D. Rockefeller and the rise and fall of the greatest oil empire America had ever seen. If you like this video, please share it as much as possible and do subscribe to Nerdvana. Thank you so much for listening.